So hello and welcome to Storytime. Thank you for joining us this week, considering it is a very, very beautiful bank holiday weekend. So to celebrate the sunshine, we're going to celebrate a book that's set in a very beautiful place in a tropical island, Treasure Island. Very much a classic, and you can be a bit closer actually today with today's copy. This is part of the Osborne series, so they've got taking over for original stories, and then these beautiful they look quite big, but it's mainly because of the illustrations, because that's the deal with this series, is that they're very intricately illustrated, which is perfect for us. So it's just a bit of an example. Just even the title pages are just beautiful, and like the actual details and everything. It's lovely. So obviously Treasure Island itself is very much an epic novel, but we're going to be jumping into the story at a particular point. But don't worry, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory and where we are, so that in case you haven't had the chance to read Treasure Island before, at least you'll know what's going on. Now, it's a very, very famous story, so in some form or fashion, most people have experienced something about Treasure Island. So whether it is an adaptation on film or on TV, or another book, or even you've actually read the whole thing, then someone has got a bit of an idea about it. So in a little bit of a different thing, this week, and actually I do have a little bit of a story about the author, Robert Louis Stevenson, and we're actually going to, I was going to do it differently and do it at the beginning to give you an idea of what to expect, but I think it might actually give away some of the story, so I'm going to come back to it at the end. But in general, for Treasure Island, we are actually going to be picking up fairly near the end of the story, as you can see. So Treasure Island is actually split into 6 different sections, and within those sections are all the chapters. The section that we're going to be looking at is the last one, section 6, and it's called Captain Silver. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, it's a bit like that. And if any of you have been on any of my story times before, you will be very aware that I love a book that has a map. Can't be a book that has a map, which is really cool. And what's really nice is obviously that means you can actually read the story along with the map. So when you are just sitting down reading it yourself, there is a really good reference point. So where we are in the story. So our narrator, so the person who's telling the story, is Jim Hawkins, and he is cabin boy upon the Hispaniola, and they are on a treasure hunt because they have a map that is reportedly going to lead them to a very large sum of treasure buried by Captain Flint on a remote island. Now, Captain Flint was originally a pirate on a ship called the Walrus, and he was not a very nice person at all, and he rather, instead of sharing his treasure with his crew, decided to bury it, and then when he died, his crew decided that they wanted it back. So that's kind of where we are, that on the new treasure hunt, some of the old crew have come along and they've been trying to get their way back to the map so that they can get the treasure they feel they deserve. So our cabin boy, Jim, before he became a cabin boy, acquired the map, and with some help of Captain Smollett and some others, he went off to try and find the treasure. At this point, they found the island, and there's been a mutiny on the ship, and the crew have taken over, and the cook, Long John Silver, has taken over as he feels he's the rightful packed in, and they are now on a trek with Jim as their prisoner to find the treasure. Chapter 32, The Treasure Hunt, The Voice Among the Trees. And this is narrated by Jim Hawkins. Partly from the dampening influence of this alarm, partly to the rest, Silver and the sick folk, the whole party, sat down as soon as they had gained the brow of the ascent. The plateau being somewhat tilted towards the west, this spot, on which we had paused, commanded a wide prospect on either hand. Before us, over the treetops, we beheld the Cape of the Woods, fringed with surf. Behind, we not only looked down upon the anchorage and Skeleton Island, but saw across the spit in the eastern lowlands a great field of open sea upon the east. Sheer above us rose the spyglass, where dotted with single pines, there black with precipices. There was no sound but that of the distant breakers mounting from all around, and the chirp of countless insects in the brush. Not a man, not a sail upon the sea. The very largeness of the view increased as the sense of solitude. Silver, as he sat, took certain bearings with his compass. "There are 3 tall trees," he said, "about in the right line from the Skeleton Island." Spyglass shoulder. "I take it means that lower pine there. It's child's play to find the stuff now. I've half a mind to dine first." "I don't feel sharp," growled Morgan, thinking of Flint. "I think it were as done to me." "Oh, well, my son, you praise the stars he's dead," said Silver. "He were an ugly devil," cried a third pirate, with a shudder. "That blue in the face, too." "That was how the rum took him," added Mary. "Blue. Well, I reckon he was blue. That's a true word." Ever since they had found the skeleton and got upon his train of thought, they had spoken lower and lower, and they had almost gone into whispering by now, so that the sound of their talk hardly interrupted the silence of the wood. All of a sudden, out of the middle of the trees in front of us, a thin, high, trembling voice struck up in the well-known air, and words. 15 men on the dead man's chest. Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. I never had seen men more dreadfully affected than the pirates. The colour went from their 6 faces like enchantment. Some leapt to their feet, others crawled hold of others. Morgan grovelled on the ground. "It's Flint! Why!" cried Mary. The song had stopped as suddenly as it begun. Broken off, you would have said, in the middle of a note, as though someone had laid his hand upon the singer's mouth. Coming so far through the clear, sunny atmosphere, among the green treetops, I thought it had sounded airily and sweetly, and the effect on my companions was the stranger. "Come," said Silver, struggling to his ashen lips to get the words out. "That won't do. Stand by and go about. This is a rum start, and I can't name the voice, but it's some skylarking. Someone that's flesh and blood, and you may lay to that." His courage had come back as he spoke, and some of the colour to his face along with it. Already the others had begun to lend an ear to this encouragement, and were coming a little to themselves, when the same voice broke out again, not this time singing, but in a faint, distant howl that echoed yet fainter among the clefts of the spyglass. "Darby McGraw," it wailed, and that is the word that best describes the sound. "Darby McGraw, Darby McGraw," again and again and again, and then, rising a little higher, with an oath that I leave out, "Fetch off the rum, Darby." The buccaneers remained rooted to the ground, their eyes starting from their heads. Long after the voice had died away, they still stared in silence dreadfully before them. "That fixes it," gasped one. "Let's go." They were his last words, moaned Morgan. His last words above board. Dick had his Bible out and was praying volubly. He had been well brought up with Dick before he came to sea and fell among bad companions. Still, Silver was unconquered. I could hear his teeth rattle in his head, but he had not yet surrendered. Nobody in this here island ever heard of Darby, he muttered. No one but us that's here. And then, making a great effort, Shipmates, he cried, I'm here to get that stuff, and I'll not be beat by man or devil. I never was feared of Flint in his life, and by the powers I'll face him dead. There's £700,000 not a quarter of a mile from here. When did ever a gentleman of fortune show his stern to that much dollars for a boozy old seaman with a blue mug, and him dead too? But there was no sign of reawakening courage in his followers, rather indeed a growing terror at the irreverence of his words. Belay there, John, said Mary. Don't you cross a spirit. And the rest were all too terrified to reply. They would have run away severely had they dared, but fear kept them together and kept them close by John as if his darling helped him. He, on his part, had pretty well fought his weakness down. Spirit? Well, maybe, he said, but there's one thing not clear to me. There was an echo. Now, no man has ever seen a spirit with a shadow. Well then, what's he doing with an echo to him, I should like to know. That ain't in nature, surely. This argument seemed weak enough to me, but you can never tell what will affect the superstitious, and to my wonder, George Merry was greatly relieved. Well, that's so, he said. You've a head upon your shoulders, John, and no mistake about it, shipmates. This here crew is on the wrong track, I do believe. And come to think of it, it was like Flint's voice, I grant you. But not just so clear away like it. After all, it was like a somebody else's voice now. It was like a... By the powers, Ben Gunn, roared Silver. Aye, and so it were, cried Morgan, springing on his knees. Ben Gunn it were. It don't make much odds, do it now, asked Dick. Ben Gunn's not here in the body any more than Flint. But the older hands greeted this remark with scorn. Why, nobody minds Ben Gunn, cried Mary. Dead or alive, nobody minds him. It was extraordinary how their spirits had returned, and how the natural colour had revived in their faces. Soon they were chatting together with intervals of listening, and not long after, hearing no further sound, they shouldered the tools and set forth again, Mary walking first with Silver's compass to keep them on the right line with Skeleton Island. He had said the truth. Dead or alive, nobody minded Ben Gunn. Dick alone still held his Bible and looked around him as he went, with fearful glances, but he found no sympathy, and Silver even joked him on his precautions. I told you, said he, I told you you'd have spilled your Bible. If it ain't no good to swear by, what do you suppose a spirit would give for it? Not that. And he snapped his big fingers, haunting a moment on his crutch. But Dick was not to be comforted. Indeed, it was soon plain to me that the lad was falling sick, hastened by heat, exhaustion, and the shock of his alarm. The fever, predicted by Dr. Livesey, was evidently growing swiftly higher. It was fine open walking here upon the summit, our way a little downhill, and for I have said, the plateau tilted towards the west. The pines, great and small, grew wild apart, and even between the clumps of nutmeg and azalea, wide open spaces baked in the hot sunshine. Striking as it did, pretty near northwest across the island, we drew, on the one hand, ever nearer the shoulders of the spyglass, and on the other, looked ever wider over the western bay, where had once tossed and trembled in the coracle. The first of the tall trees was reached, and by the bearing proved the wrong one. So with the second, and the third rose nearly 200 feet in the air above a clump of underwood, a giant of a vegetable with a red column as big as a cottage, and a wide shadow around it, which in a company could have manoeuvred. It was conspicuous far to the sea, both on the east and west, and might have entered as a sailing mark on the chart. But it was not its size now that had impressed my companions. It was the knowledge that 700,000 pounds in gold lay somewhere buried below its spreading shadow. The thought of the money, as they drew nearer, swallowed up their previous terrors. Their eyes burned in their heads, their feet grew speedier and lighter. Their whole soul was bound up in that fortune, that whole lifetime of extravagance and pleasure that lay awaiting for each of them. Silver hobbled grunting on his crutch. His nostrils stood out and quivered. He cursed like a madman when the flies settled on his hot and shiny countenance. He plucked furiously at the line that held me to him, and from time to time turned his eyes upon me with a deadly look. Certainly he took no pains to hide his thoughts, and certainly I read them like print. In the immediate nearness of the gold, all else had been forgotten. His promise and the doctor's warning were both things of the past, and I could no doubt that he hoped to seize upon the treasure, find and board the Hispaniola under the cover of night, cut every honest throat about that island, and sail away as he had first intended, laden with crimes and riches. Shaken as I was with these alarms, it was hard for me to keep up with the rapid pace of the treasure hunters. Now and again I stumbled, and it was then that Silver plucked so roughly at the rope and launched me at his murderous glances. Dick, who had dropped behind us and now brought up the rear, was babbling to himself both prayers and curses, as his fever kept rising. This also aided to my wretchedness, and to crown all, I was haunted by the thought of the tragedy that had once been acted on the plateau, when that ungodly buccaneer with the blue face, who had died at Savannah, singing and shouting for drink, had there with his own hand cut down his 6 accomplices. This grove that was now so peaceful, must then have rung with cries, I thought, and even with the thought I could believe I heard it ringing still. We were now at the margin of the thicket. "Huzzah, mates!" shouted Mary, and the foremost broke into a run, and suddenly, not 10 yards further, we beheld them stop. A low cry arose. Silver doubled his pace, digging away with the foot of his crutch like one possessed, and next moment he and I had come also to a deadly halt. Before us was a great excavation, not very recent, for the sides had fallen in and the grass had sprouted on the bottom. In this were the shaft of a pick broken in two, and the boards of several packing cases strewn around. On one of these boards I saw, branded with a hot iron, the name Walrus, the name of Flint's ship. All was clear to probation. The cash had been found and rifled. The 700,000 pounds were gone. So that was chapter 32 of Treasure Island, part of the 6th part of the story, Captain Silver, and it's part of the treasure hunt with the voice in the trees. So we leave the story where they found where the treasure is buried, but the treasure isn't there anymore. And if they're the only ones on the island, where's the treasure? And who's the voice? So, to find out, you'll just have to read Treasure Island. I know where it is, but I'm pretty sure you can guess if you've had any kind of experience of any of either the book itself or the others. So one of my favourite interpretations is the one that the Muppets done. And if anyone knows the story compared to that one, some of it's pretty close. It's pretty good. So they don't stray too far away from the story if you can ignore the fact that one of them is a frog. So I don't think the frog is part of this. But Captain Smollett is. So it's quite an intense story, and it has a lot of elements to it that have been dramatised over the years. But in reality, it's still a really exciting treasure story. The actual, it will actually be mentioned in the next part about Robert Louis Stevenson, where he gets the idea in the story. But Treasure Island wasn't the original name, but both he and I'm sure everybody else agrees it's perfect now. So just a little bit about the author, because it's quite a fascinating story actually. And then we'll have a look at the illustrations. Robert Louis Stevenson. When Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, he must have doubted that he had ever visited an island so exotic or far-flung as the one featured in his story. In his day, travel was still an expensive, arduous business, and Stevenson was a frail, sickly man, but his own life turned out to be more adventurous than any of his writings. Against all expectations, Stevenson spent his last years in a tropical paradise every bit as exciting as his literary creation. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1850, he always felt a passion for the wild landscapes of his homeland. Scottish history fascinated him and provided him with the plots for many of his stories. But although the country fueled and excited his literary imagination, it ruined his health. Edinburgh was cold and damp for much of the year, and the climate had wrecked his lungs by the time he was free. For the rest of his life, he suffered from breathlessness and violent fevers, and in the rare portraits that still exist of Stevenson, he looked pale and pained. His career as a writer took some time to get off the ground. His father and grandfather were civil engineers who helped to build lighthouses around Scotland's rocky shores. They were anxious for young Robert Louis to preserve the family tradition, so he trained for several years as an engineer at Edinburgh University. But when it became clear his health would never allow him to work outdoors, he changed his studies to law, qualifying as a barrister in 1875. But Stevenson had no desire to follow a legal career. His one childhood love had been storytelling, and in 1878 he published his first book, a comic travelogue called An Inland Voyage. He worked hard, submitting reviews, essays and short stories to book publishers and magazines. Gradually, he got some of his work accepted. At a writer's retreat, he met Fanny Osborne, an American 10 years his senior. She made quite an impression on him, and within 2 years they were married and took their honeymoon in an abandoned silver mine outside San Francisco. This wasn't as strange as it might seem. Stevenson loved an adventure. He found the Californian climate good for his young lungs, and his time in the wilderness gave him lots of material for his writing. The description of the redwood trees and oaks on Treasure Island owe more to America's fauna and flora than to any tropical habitat. And I can attest for that, having met one of those, been to see some of those giant trees in California. They are huge, and they are perfectly described in the stories, which is really cool. The idea for Treasure Island first came to him while he was lounging in a rain-lashed Scottish cottage. To keep his young stepson Lloyd entertained, he suggested they try some painting. One of their sketches was a map of a make-believe island. Stevenson joked that the isle was a pirate's den, and he covered it with woods, swamps, crosses, and other mysterious symbols. Working away at his picture, the writer's imagination sparked into life. As I pored upon my map of Treasure Island, he wrote later, the future characters of the book began to appear there, among imaginary woods and unexpected quarters. The next thing I knew, I had some papers before me and was writing out a list of chapters. Stevenson was already well respected for his travel books, essays and short stories, but at the age of 30, he still hadn't completed a full-length novel. He'd made dozens of attempts, but always got distracted or bogged down in the complexities of a long story. But his treasure map gave him a strange new feeling of confidence. Stevenson started writing feverishly, determined to produce a pirate classic. He wanted his book to be pure adventure. From the opening scenes, the reader is drawn into a murky, foggy world of roadside inns, wandering cutthroats, and dangerous secrets. To help create the ghostly, compelling atmosphere for his book, Stevenson borrowed unashamedly from earlier writers. Billy Bones, the rum-sodden ruffian who stalked Hawkins Inn, is similar to one of the characters dreamed up by Washington Irving, the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Stevenson admitted to borrowing other material from several sources, among them Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. But he didn't simply copy other writers' ideas, he refined them and made them his own. In the process, he created a character who must rank among the most famous in the world of literature, Long John Silver. The original title of the book was The Secret, in recognition of how central Silver is to the story, although he doesn't appear to almost a third of the way into the novel. Silver's gruff, menacing figure haunts the dreams of Jim Hawkins from the first pages, after Billy Bones warns him to beware the one-legged man. The reader can always sense Silver prowling on the edge of the action, pulling all the strings both on board and on land. His smooth-tongued patter, combined with physical might, allow him to cross the social boundary between several officers and crew. Stevenson wrote a chapter a day and read each new one to his family, gathered around the fireplace in the evenings. He was keen to test the pace and excitement of his story on Lloyd, but he soon discovered that his own father was equally gripped. The elderly man got so involved, he even proposed a list of items found in Billy Bones's chest, and insisted on the name Walrus for the Flint's ship. For 15 days, Stevenson raced through his novel, but on the morning of the 16th, he sat down and found he did not have a word to say. Try as he might, he couldn't make any progress, and he began to despair that the book was going to collapse like all his other attempts. For several months, he turned his attention to other work, until one day he happened to pick up his pirate's manuscript during a stay in the Swiss mountains. Once again, his pen flowed, and in 2 weeks he had finished his first book. It was a publisher who suggested the new title, Treasure Island, and Stevenson happily agreed. The book was a great success. It has never been out of print since and has sold millions of copies all over the world. Stevenson and his new family struggled financially until the publication of Treasure Island. After Treasure Island, he produced a string of other books, including Kidnapped and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. With his literary reputation booming and some money coming in, Stevenson listened to the advice of his doctors and returned to America. Fascinated by what he had heard of the Pacific, he decided on a short voyage there with his mother, Fanny, and Lloyd. In June 1888, they chartered the schooner Casco, not much smaller than the Hispaniola, from Dr. Samuel Merritt. Stevenson hired the yacht for 7 months and set sail. He would spend the rest of his life within the boundaries of the Pacific. The long sea voyage did wonders for his health. He toured the Pacific Islands, posting reports back to his publishers in London and New York. With the prospect of any return to Europe fading in his mind, Stevenson fell in love with the island of Upolu, now Western Samoa, and began putting down roots there in 1890. He built a house, Belima, and enjoyed playing the role of the benevolent laird among locals. They in turn were entertained by his efforts at farming and respected him as a writer, giving him the title Tustalia. Sorry, I think I've said that wrong. No, desire storyteller. For 4 years, Stevenson lived and worked in his island paradise on the opposite side of the world from the cottage where he had begun Treasure Island. He died suddenly on December 3rd, 1894, and was buried on a hillside overlooking the ocean. Now that's obviously quite longer than what we normally read out for the authors, but he had such an amazing adventure in his life after he wrote Treasure Island that it just had to be shared. You know, he obviously had this amazing adventure in his head, shared it in his book, and then got to live it. And I think that's incredible. So that's the story of Treasure Island and Robert Louis Stevenson, the author. I hope you enjoyed it, and like me, that you've loved another look at another pirate story, because I think I just covered it because I think that on paper, there can be so much adventure, which is great because when you're a little kid, you just want to be a pirate. So thank you for joining us, for me, Pooh Bear, and listening to Treasure Island. I hope you have a lovely time. Enjoy your bank holiday weekend, and we'll see you next week. So, bye from me and bye from Pooh Bear. Say goodbye, Pooh. Bye. Thank you for joining. Bye.